The Spring Daytona Turkey Run has a lot to offer. Gassers, pro street cars, and a lot of cool historic cars as well, including a combination that you won't believe. Every time I plan some sort of family outing, I'm guilty. I always try to base it around something car related. And in this video, we went to Daytona Beach, Florida. So the kids were off on spring break, and it just so happened that during our spring break vacation, there was the Spring Daytona Turkey Run going on at the track. So Daytona International Speedway, that's the home of the Daytona 500, tons of racing history, lots of cool events take place at the Speedway, and this is one of two Turkey Run events. One happens during Thanksgiving weekend, and the other one happens towards the end of March. So we hit it just right. We were able to spend a good day at the track. All three of the kids had a blast, and me and the wife had a good time too. It's more than you can see in one day, and be prepared to walk. This place is very big. There's a lot of ground to cover, so let's get into it. The first car we spotted was a 41 Willis Gasser, and you can see it's got a great stance. It's sitting on some street tires, some slotted mags. It's got B-gas markings on it, but I'm assuming this is just a tribute to an old Gasser. I don't know that it has a whole lot of history, but it's got a really great look to it. It's got some slick paint with some cool hand lettering on it. You'll see on the side of it, it says Willie Quick. It's got some wheelie bars out back, and it says it's a real steel car. So this is a pretty high dollar piece and definitely got a good presentation. Sitting next to it was another Gasser, this time a 55 Chevy. And this one's got a 333 cubic inch small block Chevy in it. You can see the moon tank up front, and then on top of that 333 is a Wyand supercharger with 2 Holley carburetors. And as we back up, you can see the stance on this car is really nice. It's not way up in the air, but it's got radius wheel wells, just the right amount of tire and wheel on the back of it. And this car has a lot of great hand lettering on it as well, and you can see lettered on the deck lid, tuned by ear, which I like a lot because that's how I tune all of my stuff. And on the inside, you can see this red vinyl interior, and my back and legs are sweating just looking at this. I mean, this is so cool, but I know on a hot Daytona day that these things will make you a little bit wet on the backside, but really good combination of parts on this car and a great overall look. As we made our way into the swap meet, I couldn't help but notice this 62 Corvette, and this thing is a project for sure. It's stripped down to the bare fiberglass. You can see the bonding seams. I mean, this would be a big project, but it's all there, and it's a pro street car. You can see it's got a roll cage in the back, so maybe it has some drag racing history, but this thing looks really cool. It's sitting down nice and low. It's got a set of Torque Thrust D wheels on it and big Mickey Thompson stuffed up under the back. This thing would be so cool with a slick paint job and nice interior, but if I'm being honest, I'd probably drive it just like this. In the swap meet, there were rows and rows of old parts and new parts as well, but I always get a kick out of seeing these old cars that are for sale in the swap meet area. So like this Studebaker station wagon, this is a 2-door wagon, a really rare combination, and it is rusty, it is rough, but where else are you going to find one like this? Sitting next to it is a 60 Impala 2-door hardtop, another rough one. This thing obviously needs a full restoration, but a great car to start with. Now the swap meet was so big that it'd be hard to cover it all in one video. I mean, there's a lot of parts here, but I'm picking out some of the highlights. And one of the things I liked was this Edelbrock single 4-tunnel ram. Here are a few different scoop options and other parts, but what I'm really concentrating on is at the end of the table, we got a pair of spindle mount Krager Super Trick wheels and a pair of American Racing 12-spoke spindle mount wheels. These are magnesium and they're in excellent condition. Speaking of wheels, I'm always looking for good deals on just plain old steel wheels. So when I saw these, it got my attention because they were very expensive. They've got a price tag of $900 for this set of wheels, but this is what came on Copo cars in the late 60s, so this is definitely a highly sought after item. Another cool piece is this Lenco 2-speed transmission. Now this is often used in an altered or a funny car or something like that, whereas the pro stock cars and other cars of that nature use more than 2 speeds. They have multiples of these, and that's where you see the multiple gear shift levers. This is a 2-speed piece. He was asking $1,500 for it. Also in the swap meet was this 47 Chevy Gasser. You can see that it's sitting up pretty high. It doesn't have a real radical engine or anything like that. This is a car you could drive and upgrade as you go, or go crazy with it if you wanted to. There's a lot of potential here, and it was for sale right there in the swap meet. And this is a pretty good deal here. This is a pair of pie crust slicks, and they're old. They definitely got some age on them, but they're not totally rotten. still holding air, and they're mounted to a set of Chevy Rally wheels. The guy was asking $300 for the pair. Cross ram intake manifolds are a great eye candy at any swap meet, and this was no different. This Mickey Thompson cross ram looked really cool sitting up on the table with 2 Holley carburetors. I didn't ask how much it was, I just liked looking at it. Heading back into the car show area, we got a 64 Corvette Convertible. This is a red on red car. You can see it doesn't have any kind of crazy scoop, it doesn't have fender flares, but it does have a pretty wild paint job. You can see the red base on it is pretty slick on this thing, and it's got some really cool stripes that go across the deck area, the top, the hood, and even on the vent areas down on the bottom portion of the car. It was a good old school combination. Here's another Corvette. This is like a 53 to 55 car. You can see that this might be an aftermarket body. I can see some things that are a little different than original, like the windshield's a little different. I don't know exactly the full history on this thing, but it's got a really cool Pro Street look. It's painted orange. It's got weld wheels on it, it's got giant rear tires, and it's got a really stout looking big block in there. And then sitting right next to it is a car with matching colors, so I'm assuming they're related. But this thing is really neat because it's got some extremely rare front wheels on it. This altered Roadster, it has a big block too, but what I was really looking at is the Creitz front wheels on this car. These are spindle mount wheels, and they were a competitor to American Racing, who was making a 12-spoke spindle mount wheel out of magnesium. Well, these were made out of aluminum, and they were just a little bit different design. They looked a little more like a wagon wheel, but they're extremely rare. You hardly ever run across a set of these, and the ones on this car are in excellent condition. It was sitting up on top of a very nicely done trailer as well. You can see it's got motorcycle fenders, a lot of custom details. Another cool Pro Street car is this 69 Camaro, and it's badged as a Z28, and you won't see any crazy stripes other than the Z28 stripes. You won't see any crazy body modifications. This is just a slick 69 Camaro with giant rear tires on the back. Got some billet specialty street light wheels, cool stance. This is a good looking car. Now here's a car I never thought I'd see again. This thing was built in 2000, and it went all over the country to Good Guys and NSRA and all the big car shows, and it won all the big awards. This is George Poteet's 57 Ford Ranch Wagon. It was called the Intruder, and it was built by Rad Rides by Troy. Troy Trepanier built this car, and it was a top-of-the-line custom. You can see the flush fit glass, the chop top, the crazy paint job. Everything on this car is just like it was in 2000, which doesn't seem like that long ago, but we're talking 25 years this car's been preserved. And it was sold quite a few years ago, but it was really cool to see this thing up close and personal. I had only seen it in magazines before this, so just kind of a neat moment for me. Another cool creation is this absolutely giant military truck. This thing's got pretty much a monster truck or mega truck style chassis under it, big coilovers, and look at those tires. Those are 68-inch tall tires. They're for farming use, but they look so good on this really, really huge military truck. I'm assuming it had a diesel in it, judging by those big stacks on the back of it, and it had a crowd around it all weekend long. I'd say my favorite Pro Street car at the Spring Turkey Run was this 64 Corvette Convertible. This thing's got bead locks on the back, it's got a cool stance, and then when you get around to the front of it, this is what Pro Street is all about. Big blower, big carburetors, and a giant scoop. This combination turns heads wherever it goes. The bright red paint was very slick too. I mean, this car was built very nicely, but the wow factor was undeniable. There were plenty of Pro Street cars on the property, lots of first generation Camaros, some Novas, Tri-5 Chevys. Of course, it's Chevy heavy. A lot of Chevys were turned into Pro Street cars, but you'll see this lineup of cars. There's just so many cool details here. Cool paint jobs, good stance. These guys really get it. Here's a couple of crazy ones. This is a 57 Ford Ranchero gasser, and then right next to it is a 49 Crosley that's been completely cut up. It's got a custom chassis with that front axle scooted way out there. This is kind of what you'd call an altered, I guess you could say, in drag racing terms, but just a really cool hot rod. Here's an old Survivor, this 61 Corvette. You can see the paint starting to come apart on it. The interior is not perfect. None of the car is perfect, but they hit the road with this car and have fun with it, and that's what really matters. It doesn't have huge tires on it, but in terms of a first generation Corvette, this is pretty big, so they obviously had to bring the frame rails in, modify the body to fit that type of tire and wheel. This thing's got a great look to it, and it was for sale just like many of the other cars in attendance. In the spectator parking lot, there was a wild 69 Camaro, probably the wildest of the pro street cars that I saw. This thing's got crazy paint on it, very slick paint job. You can see somebody has spent a lot of time, a lot of masking, a lot of airbrush work. Very, very well done. This thing's got a full cage in it. It's basically a race car underneath. And I don't see a blower on this car. I can't really tell what's going on under the hood, but my guess is a big cubic inch big block with some nitrous on there. Definitely one of the wildest combinations I saw. Here's another pro street car, this time a mid-70s Corvette. And this thing has some beautiful candy apple paint on it, big tires on the back, wheelie bars, the whole 9 yards, and a blower with 2.4s sticking out of the hood. This is what the Daytona Turkey Run is all about. I love cars like this. The historic race car area in the NASCAR garages has a lot of cool stuff, and it changes every year. So the spring might have different cars than the fall. You gotta check this part of the event out. I love the looks of this old school pickup truck with an old motorcycle in the back, and it turns out to be an Indian V-twin motorcycle that's set up for flat track racing. This thing is super cool, and it's strapped into the back of a mid-30s Ford pickup truck, which I later learned was built in the late 50s by the guy who's still driving it today. So he's got history with this thing. He originally put an Olds V8 in there. It now has a small block Chevy, but you can look around on this truck and see some of the history. You can see it's got D gas markings on the door. That's just kind of a throwback to his old racing days. But this thing gets driven on the street regularly, and it gets a lot of attention with that race bike in the back of it. Another car in the historic area was this 62 Buick Special. Now these are relatively small cars compared to some of the big Buick sedans, so they made for really good drag cars with the right modifications. But this one has a 308 cubic inch combination. It's also got some really rare parts. It's got rare aluminum cylinder heads. This is from a 1964 only. It's got 13.6 to 1 compression. Those cylinder heads I mentioned have been race ported by Joe Mondello. This thing has got all sorts of really cool old school parts. You'll see it's got white headers on it. It's got finned Offenhauser valve covers on there. And then overall this car is dressed in 1960s and 70s style. It's got slotted mags. Nothing real crazy on the back. It looks like maybe about a 9-inch wide slick back there. Some cool stripes. You can see the back has been modified a little bit. The back bumper has been removed. This is a cool old race car with some really rare parts on it. Here's another vintage drag car. This is a 69 Plymouth Barracuda, and we look inside of here and we see those original type bucket seats. Original type interior throughout, but it does have a roll bar. The back seat has been eliminated, and then this car has a pretty slick paint job on it with some scallops, and look at this. 426 based Hemi. This thing's probably well over 500 cubic inches. It's got a cross ram with 2 Holley 4-barrel carburetors, and look at those valve covers. Any Hemi build, it's going to cost you a lot of money. But this thing's got a cool look, cool stance. Isaac approves of it. It's got those Krager SS wheels on there, giant 14-inch wide slicks on the back. A really great looking Mopar race car. Here's another one in the historic area. This is the world's wildest Woodie. This is built by K&W Motorsports. It's based off of a 1940 Ford Woodie. You can see the wild purple paint job, the wood paneling on the side. But the really crazy part is the 426 based Keith Black Hemi that sits right behind the driver. This thing is set up to do wheel stands the length of the 1/4 mile. You can see it has a Mooneyham blower sitting up on top of that Hemi, an Enderley hat, and there's even nitrous oxide to go along with all the boost. This is a wild setup. And as we make our way around, you can see that driver's compartment. This would be crazy to drive this car because you notice it's got a lot of levers. That's for the brakes. That's for when this thing is up on the back tires, you can still steer it. And also notice that there's not a whole lot of floorboard action here, so you can see where you're going. Next is what appears to be a run-of-the-mill rear-engine dragster. It looks like your typical 90s style build, although it does have wire spoke wheels on the front, which is kind of indicative of an earlier car. So this could have been a 70s or 80s build that was updated through the years. You can see it does have a later model cage, but this thing is set up for super comp racing. It's got a pretty healthy big block with a Dominator carburetor on it. And as we go to the back, that's where it gets really interesting because this car does not have a Ford 9-inch based rear end. It actually has a Dana 60. This appears to be a magnesium center section which was cast by Henry's machine and used in Ram Charger's Pro Stock cars in the early 70s. Now Henry's also made them and sold them on their own, So they did end up in quite a few drag cars over the years, but you hardly ever see one of these in the wild, and you definitely don't see one being used in a somewhat modern rear-engine dragster. You can't go to Daytona International Speedway without paying respect to the NASCAR boys, and there was quite a few really nice looking NASCAR tribute cars and recreations on hand. And the one that really got my attention is this 62 Pontiac that's a tribute to the Fireball Roberts Daytona 500 winning car in 1962. This car had Smokey Yunick turning the wrenches on it. You'll notice the gold and black paint job. But this thing was a race winner. It was a dominating combination. And the original car was destroyed, but this recreation is pretty faithful to the original. It's got a really cool look to it and a lot of good history. Sitting next to it is another Pontiac, this time a 61. This is the Pontiac of David Pearson, the number 3 car. You can see 368 horsepower listed on the hood. You've got the Greyhound on the side of it, as this car was sponsored by Daytona Beach Kennel Club. Here's another Fireball Roberts car. Now, obviously, he changed from Pontiac to Ford, and in 1964, he drove this number 22 car. It's sponsored by Young Ford out of Charlotte, North Carolina. You can see the paint on this car is immaculate. Look inside, it's very basic, one factory type bucket seat, and that's about it. There's not a lot of creature comforts in these stock cars, even though they look like what you'd get right off the showroom floor. Now here's a rowdy round track car. This is a 55 Chevy. You can see it's got some good hand lettering on there, the number 1 on the door, and I really like this paint job. As you look inside of it, again, it's all business. You got an aluminum racing seat, big roll cage. It's got an original type dash, although it has been cut up a little bit. And you can see this car's got the fenders cut way out, big tires all the way around, wide 5 hubs on it. And you can even see it's got a factory type front bumper. They've got the headlights filled in, the hood's just pinned on there. This is just a cool old school race car with a really good look. Here's another round track car, this time on dirt. Now, this is based off of a Model T Ford. You can see the wishbones, you can see some of those Model T elements, but this is nowhere near a stock Model T. You can see it's got a 4-cylinder engine, got 4 pipes coming out of there leading into one big exhaust header, and then on the inside of this thing, there's just enough room for one person, a little skinny cockpit, little bitty area here for your body to be in, and not a lot of protection. This car does have a little bit of a roll bar hoop, but not much else. This thing's got knobby tires on the back. You'll see it doesn't have a lot of fancy components. No quick change rear end, nothing like that. It doesn't even have brakes on the front end, but it does have brakes on the back. It's got a leaf spring on the back that's been de-arched. It's got all sorts of original type pieces, and look at how the brakes work on this thing. It's a mechanical lever, just like a shift lever right here with that old school knob on there. That's what works your brakes. And it's been restored to original condition using a lot of old parts. And now for the combination that got me most excited at the Spring Daytona Turkey Run, this Model A Ford Coupe pulling a single axle trailer with a chassis research front engine dragster on the back of it. And these two cars have been put together very thoughtfully. You'll see that this dragster has a lot of history. This thing has been put away for decades. It was actually hung from the rafters of a 50s style restaurant for years, and it lost a few parts along the way, but it is very close to being put back to its original glory. And we see we've got documentation here because this car was actually featured in the February 1964 issue of Hot Rod magazine. But I find it very interesting that it was featured in 1964 because it's a very antiquated chassis design, and then of course the engine. This is an old Ford Flathead. There's not a whole lot of technology going on here. It had an old style blower. It had old style everything. So very interesting that this car was getting some recognition. And you can see a lot of the pieces that were in this magazine article are still on this car today. This car started with a chassis research frame. You'll see that the front suspension has been modified from some of those early chassis research cars. It has a much more standard front axle setup. And these are all Kent Fuller components. The front axle, the shocks, and even the wheels are Kent Fuller. Very high-end pieces for the day. Out back, it's got an early Ford rear end that's been narrowed significantly to fit inside the chassis. And then outside, it's got magnesium Halobrand wheels. These are the smooth wheels, no windows. These are very early, very hard to find, and these are in immaculate condition. And they're mounted to a set of US Royal recap slicks. So these 8 2015 slicks, you'll see in the article it says it had 8 2015s. That's still what it has today. So this thing was originally put together by Richard Blackman and Jim Albert. And their whole idea for building this was to experiment with engine combinations, and they were going to produce a dual overhead cam conversion for Ford Flathead V8s. Definitely a high-end modification on an antiquated engine combination. So to my knowledge, they never put the dual overhead cams on this combination, but it does have Edelbrock aluminum heads on it. It's got a SCoT blower with 3 two-barrel carburetors on there. It's got a body that was built by Bob Sorrell. The interior was by Tony Nancy, some big names in drag racing back in the day. And this thing has got so many cool pieces already, and they're looking for just a few more to finish it out. So the Dragster itself is obviously a very cool piece, but you'll see that it's sitting on a very old school single axle trailer. That's another piece of the puzzle here, as it's set up to pull behind this Model A Ford. This thing is cool too. It's chopped, it's channeled, it's got a small block Chevy, wide white wall tires, a lot of old school pieces. So when you see this combination together, I mean, it is just too cool. A Ford Model A hot rod pulling a front engine dragster that's got all this period correct stuff. That by far was my favorite combination at the Spring Daytona Turkey Run. On our way back from Daytona Beach, we had to make a pit stop in McDonough, Georgia at the Summit Racing Store. We saw some really cool stuff before we even walked in the door, including this old school Chevy van. They've put a really cool looking satin turquoise paint job with a white roof, and you can see they've given the interior some attention as well. Then we got an old Chevy 5-window pickup truck. It's in flat black, and this thing may be sitting on an S10 frame. It's definitely got a narrow track width. It's sitting on some American racing wheels, a good looking driver pickup. Now this place is huge. And you can go in here and buy just about anything you want because they have such a big warehouse. You can go in there and spend all your money. So the first thing I saw when we first walked in was this 68 Plymouth Barracuda. And they've got this turntable right up front. They've actually got 2 of them right in the front of the building, and they switch these cars out all the time. So there's always something different up here. But this 68 Barracuda is a slick car. You can see that paint is super slick on this thing. It's got a 426 Hemi, but it's not the old one. This has got a late model Hemi in it. You can see this car is kind of set up for drag racing. It's got skinnies on it, it's got slicks on the back, but this thing would win any show it entered. It is slick, very well detailed car, and very tastefully done. On the other turntable was a more pro touring style car. This is a Buick GS, and this thing is black. Very slick black paint job. You can see the blacked out wheels, the blacked out bumpers, grille. It does have some red accents, and you can see no LS swap in this thing. It's got old school horsepower, big disc brakes on it, modern bucket seats. This thing is a great combination of old school horsepower with modern wheels, brakes, suspension, and exterior treatments. Hanging from the ceiling is one of Don Garlits' Swamp Rat dragsters. And this has got a pretty interesting story. Of course, I always research old drag cars. And this is Swamp Rat number 15. This is the car that was built after Don Garlits had his famous clutch explosion that cut the car in half and severed part of his foot and led to the development of the rear engine dragster. So he was building the rear engine dragster. He never could get it to handle the way he wanted it. So he went back to the shop and built another front engine dragster. Well, his wife came out there and caught him in the act, said, "You're not going to go back out there in this front engine car and kill yourself." So he put this car to the side, finished building the rear engine dragster and refined it and finally got it to work right. And this Swamp Rat number 15 was never raced. It was completed, and it was actually sold to Goodyear as a display vehicle. They kept it for a few years and gave it back to Don, and he ultimately cleaned it back up and sent it up to McDonough, Georgia when Summit was building this building. So it's been up there for quite a while, and it's definitely a cool piece of drag racing history, although it never made a pass. My favorite part is being able to walk through the scratch and dent area, and they mark these things down cheap. So we walked through all of that. In that scratch and dent area was this display engine. This is a Blueprint Engines 632 cubic inch crate engine with 815 horsepower. You could drop this thing into anything and be fast.
Puppy.
Oh, puppy in a Corvette. What'd you find? Let me see it. Let me see it. Whoa, that's cool. Coker Classic. Wow. Very nice. That's a nice display there. Of course, we didn't go home empty-handed. I had to find a few pieces. The kids had to find a few pieces. This is definitely better than our normal Buc-ee stop on the way home from the beach. We had an awesome time at the beach and at the Spring Daytona Turkey Run and at our pit stop at Summit Racing on the way home. I hope you enjoyed following along with us. Thank you for watching.